Mist lay on the god's eye like breath held too long, silvering the lake, thickening toward the low, dark oval of the Isle of Faces until the island seemed to float in a cradle of cloud. A skiff rocked at the pebbled strand as men in black oilskins eased a chest aboard and raised a short mast. The oarlocks creaked once. Then the sound died, swallowed by water and fog. Jon stood with the skiff's stern rope wrapped around his palm. Ghost paced the shore in a loop, the direwolf's pads silent on damp stones, pale fur drinking what little light the dawn put out. The wolf's red eyes found him again and again as if to ask whether this was wise. The air smelled of wet reed and iron, the kind of smell that made a man remember everything that could rust. Dolorous Ed hunched in his cloak beside Jon, muttering to no one. "This is where they'd hold the parley if they wanted it to go wrong," he said. "Islands are for trapping fools. You row out full of hope, you row back with none, if you row back at all." "The Isle has seen packs before," Jon said. "Better ones than any we've had in living memory." "Before my memory is most things," Ed said. "Which is a mercy." Jon released the rope. The line hissed through his hand. The skiff gave a patient tug. Howland Reed waited already aboard, wiry as a sapling, hood dripping, eyes the green-brown of the bog. He wore simple leathers, a long knife strapped to his thigh with lacings that looked like cattail. He had not smiled when they greeted. He had dipped his head and said, "You come not as Stark, but as Snow and as sworn brother. That is good." Then, more quietly, "And still it is you." The lake bent all voices. Even quiet words came back changed. Jon set a hand to Ghost's skull. The wolf leaned into it with the weight of trust that had no language. "Stay," Jon whispered. Ghost lay down without taking his eyes off the fog. The first stroke of the oars sent loons from a patch of open water. Their wings cut skeins into the surface that lasted half a heartbeat before closing. Castle Harrenhal loomed ash-gray within the veiling mists to their right. It was too big to seem a thing made, too gutted to seem a thing alive. Once, Jon might have taken it for a warning. He had learned that most places large enough for warnings held also the chance for shelter, if one knew where not to stand. He sat near the chest and laid a palm to its lid. Cold bled from the iron strap into his skin. The world they hoped to make lay in such a box, as terrible and as light as a folded letter. He thought of a different box, hammered black, that had once held the heads of men pledged to him, and another box, rough pine, that had nearly been his before warmth bled back to fingers and Melisandre's ash-fed breath went thin as cobweb. The dead always kept a hand on the living. It steadied and it tugged. "The green men sent a boatman," Howland Reed murmured, lifting his chin toward a shadow that separated itself from the fog and slid toward them with the effortless motion of something that had known these waters since water first took this shape. The other craft was low and narrow, made of something that gleamed dully, smooth bark or shaped reeds. It was hard to tell. The figure at the stern wore a cloak the color of moss after rain and a helm carved like antlers. He said nothing. He did not need to. He skimmed past, eyes on them, then turned his canoe and fell in at their side, guiding them toward the island's arm of reeds as a shepherd dog runs the edge of a flock. "We step onto ground where oaths have weight," Howland said as their keel rasped reed to earth. "Say only what you mean. Leave the rest behind." Jon nodded. He had never been good at leaving the rest behind. The Isle of Faces rose no more than a man's height above the lake in most places, a tangle of wet roots and old stones. The trees began at once. Weirwoods, more of them than Jon had ever seen, their pallid trunks twisting skyward, bark smooth as old bone, red leaves beating with wet. Faces carved in ancient days watched the shore with the red-eyed steadiness that had unsettled the hearts of the first men who dared lift an axe against green. Some faces were calm, some sorrowing, some fierce. In a few, the knife that had cut had been sure enough to leave a faint humor in the lips. The air beneath the canopy was not cold. It was the air a man felt in a cloak that had lain out all night absorbing dew, cool and a little heavy, as if it remembered weather too well to be surprised by it. They were not first. Campfires smoldered within stone circles near the central clearing. Men and women moved between them with food and bundles of documents bound in leather. A cluster of Riverlords' banners drooped on their poles, their colors muddied by mist. A taller banner stood alone, the seven-pointed star sewn in pounded gold, beads of moisture clinging to the points like dew on a web. Near it stood a tidy knot of men in plain gray, heads shaven, belts empty save for binding knives. They did not wear swords. Poor fellows rarely did. Jon knew too well that hands could make war without steel. Septon Maribald? Jon asked Howland under his breath, nodding toward the gray. Sent for, but stayed on the roads, Reed said. The roads are his temple. The High Septon sent most devout instead. Men who are walls before they are doors. Walls keep out the sea, Ed put in, until water remembers that it can climb. A man in the most devout's group stepped forward. He was tall, skin drawn tight over a long, serious face. His graying beard forked just enough to show care without vanity. Jon Snow, he called. His voice was not loud, but the Isle's damp seemed to carry it. I am Septon Reynard, speaking with the voice of the most devout in the matter of the accord. The High Septon has sent his blessing and his frank instruction that the faith militant stands prepared to attend in the spirit of peace. In the spirit of peace entails no blay. To warn before the sight of the seven. I see none upon you. No more than two, Ed said so low only Jon heard. And neither mine. Jon stepped forward. Septon Reynard, my vows forbid me to wed, father children, hold lands or titles. They do not forbid me to walk from one fire to another when the world is cold and asking for it. I've come to see if we can find common heat. I've brought witnesses of mine own. He gestured to Howland Reed and to the chest. And if the seven find our gathering good, I ask them to see it well. The old gods will be watching. The green men will be listening. The boatman in the antler helm had drawn up near the trees. He had not lowered his spear. Jon wasn't sure if it was a spear. The point was leaf-shaped if it had a point at all. The man's white horsehair beard poked forward from beneath the visible line of his jaw. He nodded a fraction, as if to say that he had been paid no insult. It occurred to Jon, then, that being paid no insult was a sort of coin dearer than gold precisely because it could not be minted. Let us convene beneath the faces, said another voice, musical and deep. A woman stepped into the clearing wearing a dress sewn from gray-green cloth that lay like water over her shoulders. Her hair was braided back and held with pale antler pins. She carried no weapon. The way she moved made the absence heavier than any spear. I am Greenwood's daughter, she said. Some call me that, at least. If you need a name other than mine, use that one. Septon Reynard bowed, properly and without excess. We thank the island's keepers for their hospitality. The woman nodded once. Her eyes did not leave his. Then she turned and led the way into the clearing. The faces seemed to lean a little as they passed. Jon tried not to look too long at anyone. It was a small thing he had learned, to mistake being watched with deserving to be. They took their places on woven mats around the circle's edge. The mats had been laid long before they arrived. Reed sat at Jon's right, Ed at his left. Septon Reynard and his fellows arranged themselves opposite. Between the groups, the chest sat unopened, beads of water gathering on its iron band. We sign no thing, Greenwood's daughter said, as if starting with disappointment meant ending closer to truth. We speak. If speaking makes a thing that lasts, it is because the thing was already here waiting to be named. If we must scratch it on hide to show men who were not listening, we will, but ink is a poor root. Septon Reynard folded his hands. Words written can hold men when memory fails. We are all farther from our fathers than we like to admit. Our hands wander when they are not recalled. Then recall them, said Reed lightly. I remember a time when a boy near your city tried to take a red dragon's egg from a hawk's nest because he'd heard that kings hatched such things from fire. He nearly fell. He did not. He remembered when he chose where to place his feet. Reynard blinked. It might have been a smile. I have not forgotten the tale of that tourney. I have not forgotten those who wore masks they could not keep. Jon heard a ghost of hall music in the older man's words. He set his mind to the matter at hand. "We've seen too much burning," he said. "We've seen too many trees cut for want of understanding why they stood at all. We've seen too many men and women beaten in the name of a god. I've seen others in the dark. They do not pray to any face. The cold they bring is patient. It's stronger than all our reasons for hating one another. If we do nothing else here, I would have us agree that men must not be beaten or burned for how they call the divine." Reynard's long fingers tightened. The seven abhor wanton cruelty. The arms of the faith were taken up again in King's Landing to restrain disorder and sin that suffocated the city.
Sin likehunger?
Ed murmured. "Sin like lords doing as they please and calling it a feast for the poor," Reynard said, and Ed flinched as if he'd been overheard. "We cannot be blind to the nettles that grow on our roads. But we are not in King's Landing. We are here. And here it is true that the faith, men of it, not always its will, have shorn weirwoods and carried their limbs to bake for bread ovens. It is true that some who pray beneath leaves have drowned septons in their wells. Men always drag their own devils to holy ground. If we lie and say it is not so, the faces will know." "How would the seven read the faces?" Greenwood's daughter asked. "As symbols of the yearning all men keep," Reynard answered without a beat. "As the father's justice in one line of the mouth, the mother's mercy in another. I have kneeled before trees. Do not tell the most devout. They think smoke is the only true tincture of prayer." A companion of Reynard's, a younger septon with tidy ears, shifted, scandal trying to remember how it wore its own face. Reynard flicked 2 fingers, barely rest he meant. "Then speak your yearning," Reed said. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, the frog spear's memory in the set of his hands. "Say what you want, Septon, not what your city wants. Say what you want for the realm." Reynard inhaled. He let mist into his lungs and held it there long enough to embolden it into words. "I want fewer pyres." "Good," said Jon. "I want the God's Wood at Winterfell to stand as long as there are stones for men to trip over their own feet within it. I want no septon harried in Barrowton for carrying a 7-pointed star. I want the faith to lay down its swords in the north and Riverlands and leave judgments to lords and their laws save in their own precincts. And I want lords to swear that a man's prayers in his house are no business of his neighbor so long as they spill no blood. I want," he added, and it felt like putting a hand to a blade he'd carried too long, "no more children to die because grown men like to hear their own gods answered with screams." "And Hat do the old gods want?" asked the tidy-eared septon, as if he were popping a bubble others were too careful to break. Greenwood's daughter tipped her face toward the tree beside her. The leaves hung wet and perfectly still. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come a finger's width deeper. "They want what they are, rooting, watching, remembering, never needing to be told their names by mouths. They do not want to strike men. They want men to be men under them and not fools. The trees did not drink blood before men brought blood to them. Do not lay that on the roots." Reynard closed his eyes. He nodded. Jon let the breath out of his chest slowly. "Then we begin," he said, and finally laid both his hands flat atop the chest. Septon Reynard's brows rose. "You have brought?" "A reminder," Jon said. He undid the iron clasp. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a tight bundle. He lifted it and cradled it in the crooks of both arms as if it were a newborn, then rolled the cloth back. The smell took the sting out of the mist, the sharp, clean wrongness of a thing that had forgotten it had been dead. It was not a head or a hand. Jon had decided against those. He had brought the curved rib of a white and a shard of other bone, charred to black where flame had turned it true and fluttering still at the edges where the fire had not been complete. Beside it was a blade of dragon glass, translucent dark with fractures like lightning caught and tamped down. He placed both on the mat before him. "Bone," the tidy-eared septon said with too much relief, as if he were happy to call a storm a cloud. "Bone is bone." "Then hold it," Ed said. "I hold trouble for luck sometimes. It has not improved my luck once, but it has made my luck feel sharper." Septon Reynard held out his hands. They were clean. He picked up the rib. For a heartbeat it lay lightly, unremarkable. Then it sang in his palms without sound. The older man's mouth tightened. He did not drop it. He held it until his fingertips whitened. Then he laid it down as carefully as he would have put a babe into a cradle. "It is wrong," he said simply. "It walks without a heartbeat when it is joined to others of its kind," Jon said. "It kills without anger. Fire can make it remember it should lie down. Dragonglass can help men kill the cold servants. I am not asking the seven to worship stones. I am asking that in the accords we write, caches of obsidian be kept where the realm can find them, guarded without blasphemy by both faiths, and that the faith blesses men who use Valyrian steel to fight something that mocks life, rather than using it to cut their neighbors. Bless what is worthy of being blessed when it is time," Reynard murmured. "We are too eager to large absolutions. Large absolutions sour into tyranny quicker than milk left upon a hearth. But small permissions that we can give like bread." "How?" asked the tidy-eared Septon again, wary, desperate to understand what doorway would allow him to remain himself. "With words," said Greenwood's daughter. "With a remembering easier than law. With a story men can tell to one another without bringing parchments and seals. In the dawn accord the seven will say, 'Leave the trees that remember. Let the knives dull themselves elsewhere.' The old gods' people will say, 'Leave the stones with 7 points alone. Let your zeal break upon tides somewhere other than doorposts.' The watch will say, 'Leave us to our work. Do not tug at our sleeves while we hold back winter.' And then when men forget, they will tell the story and remember they agreed to this. Parchment can burn. Wood also burns. Men set both aflame when frightened. But sometimes telling a woman of a promise she herself might have made if she had been here, sometimes that is enough." Reed's small smile deepened. "A story that tastes like something a man already knows he should do." Septon Reynard's mouth creased, approving without wanting to show how much. "Very well," he said. "Let us set this story's spine with a few sentences. The High Septon cannot unarm the faith in a breath, but he can forbid the faith militant from entering the north under arms without a writ from both a northern lord and a most devout. And he can instruct that weirwoods be left untouched by any under his purview save to protect men from immediate harm, and that we bring to trial any who cut one down after this day." "You speak for him?" Jon asked. "I speak for the part of him that remembers he is a shepherd before he is a wall," Reynard said. "There is another part. It dreams of being a wall so strong men need never walk again. I am not its tongue. I can carry a letter north," Jon said. "And in White Harbor, Lord Manderley's Septon will read it aloud to men who have known both gods. They'll understand more quickly than most." "Wyman Manderley knows craft and prayer," Reynard said, as if tasting admiration and not minding the taste. "We will send letters with 7 seals to White Harbor, Barrowton, Winterfell itself if any scion of the line will open them without burning the wax for warmth. The line that opens is the one that matters," Reed said, and for a moment a hollow passed over his face like the cloud shadow over the lake. "There are things men will know when it is time." A bird cried in the high branches, one sharp note and then silence. The Greenwood's daughter turned her face slightly, as if to let the sound slide along her cheek and be absorbed. "We will speak our limits," she said. "The old gods' folk will not kneel in septs unless they wish, nor will they be kept from burial beneath trees when there are trees left. We will not see our dead burned except when wind demands it. We will not accept septons interfering with the rites in our groves, nor will we interfere in theirs. We do not crave converts. We ask only the right to keep our dead among the living woods, so their names do not fall into holes." "Done," Reynard said, without confer. "Ring." The younger Septon caught his breath with a sound half like a laugh, half like a choke, but said nothing. "You ask modest things that will save much blood." "And you?" Jon asked. "What do you ask, Septon?" Reynard looked at the bone, then at the blade of glass, then at the faces. "I ask that when thugs drag our people from their septs in the dark of winter nights and drown them in wells, the old gods' folk will bring them out again and lay them somewhere clean. I ask that when bread is short, your lords remember that some of our poorer carry their altars in their empty stomachs, and that the mother and father may be answered with crusts. I ask that our orphans be allowed in your halls to eat without being told every day that the stranger to whom they pray is a demon." Greenwood's daughter bowed her head. "Done," she said. "We will not tolerate cruelty in our name." She glanced sideways at Jon. "You, Snow, say what you will ask of both." He had not thought until that instant that he would be allowed to ask. His mouth did not need to shape the words. They had lived in him long enough to know their own way out. "When the dead come walking in the snows near a village, I ask that bells be rung. Sept bells, ironwood clappers, a blade against a pot, any sound men will recognize for warning, and that all doors open to the watch from White Harbor to Maidenpool, no matter what god is burning incense upon their shelf. I ask that each sept and each gods would keep a box of obsidian arrowheads and 2 spears worth of glass, and that those who go north to hunt or trade swear they will carry 1 sharp piece on their person and 1 for a friend. I ask that when rumors begin to turn on their own tails and men begin to blame a god for what the cold has always wanted, both faiths step into the lane and tell the truth loudly enough to shame them. Truth spoken loudly rarely shames those who need it," Ed offered, because it was his nature to do so. "But sometimes it saves the bystander listening." Reynard's eyes softened. "Done," he said. "We must contrive a name for this accord that will live more easily than a line of ink." "They will call it what they need," Greenwood's daughter said. "Names take root if men water them. Let them." They were still agreeing to call a thing by no name when the first blade came out of the mist. It came from behind Reynard's group, swift and sure, a short knife honed to nothing, glinting just enough for a hungry eye to see itself in. The man who'd drawn it wore rough gray, like any poor fellow, but his head had not been shaved well. Stubble glistened on his skull like seed. Jon saw the motion even before the Greenwood's daughter moved. He had no sword. He had come unarmed as promised. But he had his hands and the closeness of this place. He slid forward to Reynard's shoulder, caught the attacker's wrist with both palms and twisted. The blade licked the mat. The man snarled and used the same force to drive his knee up. Jon felt dull shock bloom just above his thigh. He buried his shoulder in the man's chest and shoved him backward hard enough that breath should have left him. It did not. The man was a well. Emptiness filled him and made him heavy. A second blade flashed. Ed threw himself at its owner with a sound like a man deciding to slip off a roof and be done with it. Howland Reed had already moved, not with force but with angles. He spun the first attacker onto his back with a trip that made use of roots. The man fell into wet, and astonishment shocked his face for 1 clean beat before his mouth tore open with a wordless curse. The Greenwood's daughter stepped over him, bent, and put her thumb softly to his throat. The man went still. Jon could not see what she had done. He hoped it had been nothing final. He hoped, which was foolish. 2 more men in gray broke from the fog. Jon saw the glory of the trick too late. Come with their own and you may pass. Carry a star at your breast and men make space for you. Let them look at your brow and not your hands. The nearest man drew a shape from beneath his cloak that did not fit any of Jon's thoughts about knives. Then Jon understood. It was a star made of iron, 7 points honed, braced so a man could wrap his hand at its center and swing. Ghost came out of the fog like a thrown piece of ice. The dire wolf hit the man's elbow and the iron star spun free as if disgusted by its own owner. It thumped the ground and slid. Jon kicked it a pace beyond anyone's reach. Septon Reynard had secured the tidy-eared younger man behind him with 1 hand and was chanting in a low voice that meant to quiet an angry animal and was, in this case, being tried against a different sort of beast. "Stop," Jon said, and knew even as he said it the word rarely stopped anything except breath. He caught the last man from behind with both arms and lifted his feet from the ground. The man writhed. Jon tightened until the struggle went from a storm to a worry, then to stillness. He had broken a man's neck before with this grip. He did not now. He set the captured man on the mat and knelt with a knee in his back. "How many?" Reed asked the fallen, conversational as midwives. "Enough." That answer was never true. It always meant the opposite. "Whose word do you carry?" Reynard asked. His voice was soft. The Greenwood's daughter had set 2 fingers to the man's temple and was watching him with an expression Jon had seen men wear when they were listening for a sound far off. A bell, perhaps, or the feet of someone they loved coming up a stair. The attacker coughed. Blood touched his lip. "The only word that matters," he said. "They cut down trees when the Undulls came. We must finish what was started. We must cleanse the land." "They who?" Reynard asked. "The faith." The man breathed, triumphant, as if hearing the sound of a gate closing behind him he'd hoped to slip through. "Liar," Reynard said simply. He did not hiss or glower. He spoke, as if remarking on weather. "You are not of my faith. You are of a kind that finds fervor and makes any god into a cudgel with which to strike whatever your fear points you to. The 7 will not have you. I will see you judged." The man spat. "Judge me, then. This isle is witchwork. Those who make love to trees cannot claim law. Men who decide to kill under any face cannot claim it either," Reed said. "You had thought to strike a blow where the air was clean and make us all choke on it." Ghost's lip lifted. The Greenwood's daughter's 2 fingers pressed. The attacker's eyes rolled white and then closed. "He will wake," she said mildly, "and he will be sorry his wrists find rope. But we will not answer blade with blade here. This is not soil for it." The star of iron lay in the reeds. The water had already taken a thin film of blood from its point and stretched it so thin it could hardly be said to be anything at all. Jon's hands trembled suddenly. Now that it was over, now that it would not be over for someone else if they did not continue. He looked at Septon Reynard. The man looked back at him with an expression that held weariness and something like relief. "It is good we make this accord on a day when blood asked to be spilled and was told to wait," Reynard said. "It will give the story a strong spine." They bound the attackers with cords woven from lake grass. The green man watched without moving. When the men were secured, he stepped forward and took their bonds and led them away, not toward any tent, but into the trees, as if the isle itself were willing to judge. They returned to their mats as if such interruptions were as common as passing gnats. Perhaps they were. "A clause," Reynard said, as if picking up a thread he'd only laid aside to swat a fly. "The faith will condemn any use of the 7-pointed star as a weapon. We will say it blasphemes us to turn a sign into a blade." "Good," Jon said. "And the old gods' folk will say the same of Heartwood. No spear points carved of the trees. No stakes made of what should remember." Greenwood's daughter inclined her head. "Done." They spoke until the mist thinned and the sun found a way to insinuate itself through the leaves. The light lay on faces and made them look older and calmer. They set down the bones of a plan in the words of men, who hoped never to see it written on a piece of hide and displayed in some lord's hall as proof of his virtue. The more they said, the more it began to feel like something men might remember. At the last, the Greenwood's daughter stood, and all stood with her, not in obeisance, but because it felt wrong to remain seated when a tree in a woman's shape rose. "Bring water," she said, and a child who had not been there a moment before and now was, eyes large and dark beneath a cap of twigs, went at once to fetch a bowl carved from an old knot. It was filled from a spring whose mouth lay beneath a curtain of roots. The water was clear and carried such a chill it made the bones in Jon's mouth ache when he sipped it. He passed it to Reynard. The Septon drank without fear. He passed it on. When it came back to the Greenwood's daughter, she dipped a branch of red leaves and let 7 drops fall onto the mats between the groups. Then she dipped it again and let 7 drops fall over the chest. The water beaded on the iron like pearls. "Let the faces see," she said, and in that instant Jon thought he did see movement in the carved lids. No more than rain running into a groove. But he felt less alone than he had since the night he had bled onto snow and thought he would find out at last what there was after a man finished being a man. A bell sounded then. It was not near. It came across the water from the shore. A peal thin and brave. Second peal, then a faster third. It was a panic bell. Not the bell a sept rings when it welcomes child or bride. Then other bells farther. The sound spidered across the god's eye, thin threads that nevertheless held. Men looked up as men always do when something they cannot see tells them something their feet had not yet felt. Jon rose without thinking. Ghost was already on his feet, ears forward. "What is it?" Ed asked, and then, because it was Ed, "It will be the best thing if it is bread." "Smoke," Reed said. "But not from us. There are fires that call for water and fires that call for men." Jon did not like the speed with which his boots remembered the shape of the ladder. He moved to the lake and looked, but the mist denied him. Then a long, low canoe slid out of reeds with the green man at its stern. He gestured with 3 fingers. Reed nodded. "We should go," he said. Septon Reynard was already binding his cloak. "The bells ring for us," he said. "If Zeal tries to stop the accord before ink can teach it manners, let Zeal find hands equal to their own." They went in 2 boats, Jon's, low and clumsy, and the green man's, which cut the water like a needle cuts cloth. The mist peeled back before them, then settled again. As they drew near the shore, smell came first, the acrid sweet of pitch, the dry bright of burning straw. Through a hole in the fog Jon saw a shape. A small sept on a rise, stone no higher than a man could reach, whitewash peeling, its single bell swinging under a wooden frame. Below it, men were running, and another, smaller building, one of the huts for those who cared for the place, was already fire. Beside the sept stood a sapling weirwood, bark still pink with youth, its face a tender mistake. It had likely been planted by some fool who meant well and had no idea how trees chose their places. It should not have been on a hill. It should have been seeking shade by water. It would not have lived many winters. But it had begun a thing, and now men with torches were running for it. Jon's boat scraped shore. He jumped, water biting his calves, and ran for the hill. Ghost was a breath ahead of him. The men with torches wore no stars on their chests. They wore no totems on cords. They had dressed themselves in anonymity to better dismiss their own faces when asked later what they had done. Ed tripped the first with a staff. The man spun and came up howling. He swung his torch. Ed took it on his forearm and gasped, then jammed the butt of the staff into the other's stomach with a noise like a man stirring porridge he did not care for. The torch hit the ground and rolled, a mouth licking the hill, but the grass was damp and needed more convincing. Jon reached the second man at the tree. He clamped a hand on the man's wrist and squeezed until fingers opened. The torch fell. He stamped it out. "No," Jon said to the man's face, simple as Reynard's lyre, and the man's eyes widened as if someone had told him rain was wet. Unthinkable, unanswerable. He swung his free hand. Jon took that blow and answered with one of his own, low into the ribs where the fist convinced the body it had been foolish to house such thoughts. The man folded. At the sept door, Septon Reynard grappled with 2 men. He had lived his life holding scrolls and prayer books. He knew how to hold men. Reed wove between legs and torches and took a torch out of a hand without the hand noticing how it had been persuaded. He used its head to strike the third man's shin. The torch went out. The man went down. Ghost had the 4th flat on his back, jaws at his throat, breathing the kind of shudder that made future and past change places. Greenwood's daughter climbed the hill as if walking through a garden in late afternoon. She reached the weirwood as Jon was turning to check the September. She set her palm upon the sapling. Her lips moved. The leaves did not. The bell had stopped. Inside the sept, Jon could hear only the sound of his own blood and the whisper a small fire makes when it is beginning to think itself larger. He pushed the door and smoke slid out, then up. 3 children crouched beneath the altar, their eyes open too wide, as if they were trying to swallow the room. 2 women stood before them as if their bodies might be stones. An old man in a half-septon's robe held a pewter bowl and a look that said he had never expected to see this and had always known that he might. "Out," Jon said. "Now." "Out," Reynard repeated behind him. And when the women saw the gray and the beard, they moved not because of the words but because of the shape that had made them. They gathered the children and ran. The half-septon lingered a heartbeat long enough to look at the 7 oils on the small altar and then at the tree visible through the door. He took 1 lamp, only one, and ducked outside. By the time they gained the hill's crest again, the last of the men with torches were under guard, wrists bound. Others were running down the far slope, confused, abandoning the thought they had arrived with because it had failed to do the thing their fear demanded. Men ran well away from their beliefs when their beliefs did not obligingly shape the world before their eyes. Septon Reynard stood with the small congregation before the September. He raised both hands and spoke in that low voice again, words for men after panic. He did not scold them. He gave them back to themselves. Jon, breathing hard, set his hands upon his thighs and let his heart learn again that it did not need to throw itself against his ribs. He looked at the weirwood. Greenwood's daughter still had her hand upon it. Her head was bowed. The sapling looked no less out of place upon the hill. It would die in winter, but not today. Not because men who could not tell one comfort from another had set cloth to pitch. The half-septon came to Jon. "I would have saved the oils," he said, as if confessing a ridiculous crime. "They are dear. Winter takes more than men." "Winter takes ideas if you let it," Jon said. "Keep what you need." He looked at the man's hands. They were black under the nails, scrubbed often and never fully clean. "Brother," he added, not of the faith, not of the old gods, but of the kind of work that turns fingers to graven things. The man blinked, then nodded as if he had been seen putting a loaf in some child's hand. Reynard dismissed the crowd with promises that sounded like nothing so much as ordinary instructions. "Fetch water, send one boy to White Harbor with a letter, keep the doors unbarred to those fleeing snow." He came to Jon then. "You see how quickly a thing can break," he said, a set of words hardly born, and already there are hands at its throat, and it wails as any infant might if it had breath enough. "Then we keep saying it," Jon said, "until men stop asking it to wail." They bound the captured men and sent them under guard to a riverlord's camp, to be judged under law that had nothing to do with gods and everything to do with the workmen had given to laws, so that they might not each be forced to be their own. The bells slowed, then stopped. The smoke from the hut drifted into reeds. Jon realized he was very tired, the kind of tired that remembered a time he had lain on his back in snow with life going light as a lifted veil. They returned to the aisle. The faces seemed to regard them without either approval or disappointment, as if they had seen many such days when men, good and otherwise, attempted to coax the weather. No one sat again. They stood in a knot. "Men will say you brought attack with you," the tidy-eared Septon said to Jon in a voice that tried not to accuse. "They always say trouble comes with the ones who name it." "They may say the attack came because a tree watched," Ed put in. "I would prefer they blame me. I am used to it." "They may say it," Greenwood's daughter said, "and the aisle will say nothing back. And when their anger has eaten its own tail and found it unappetizing, they will remember what else we said." She looked at Jon then. Her eyes were older than her face. "You are trying to make two continents lie together without teeth. You may yet do it." "Yamo." "And why one man?" Jon said. "You are two," she said, "the one who holds oaths in his mouth, and the one whose ribs have known the cold from within. Men listen better to someone who has died and sat up again. It is a monster's charm, and it is unfair, and you may use it." Reynard drew in a breath that sounded like he was reshelving a book carefully. "I will carry these words south," he said. "I will speak them to a man who has forgotten his own name several times under the weight of others' calls for him. I will say to him, do not set men with brooms against saplings and call it cleanliness. I will say to him, if you must be a wall, be one that leaves a door open." He hesitated. "I will also say to him that the watch has asked for obsidian caches, and that I saw a thing on a mat that made a noise I did not hear." "What of your zealots?" Reed asked. Reynard's mouth twisted, not quite a smile. "They are your zealots too. They are anyone's who finds fear easier to love than a god. We will set them sermons, and rope when that fails." "You will not be harmed leaving," Greenwood's daughter said. "The lake owes you a smooth crossing." She stepped nearer to Jon. She smelled faintly of rain come through stone. "You must remember, when the first story fails, tell it the second time differently. Not as a change, but as a remembering you forgot one corner." "Which corner did I forget now?" Jon asked. "The one that says the old gods are not gods like yours are gods." she said. Remember to tell your people that the faces do not need defense. The living do. He nodded, and lifted a hand. If I am to remember 2 stories, should I not carry a 3rd? I am always forgetting one, and if I keep 3, I might by mistake land on the one that matters. Carry a joke, Reed said to him. Jokes last longer than laws. I am a joke, Ed said. I will last forever. They took their leave. The green man led John's skiff out from the island until the line of fog opened into a small isle. John lifted his hand, palm up, in something like thanks. The green man did not mirror him. He dipped a paddle. It looked like a benediction anyway. On the shore again, Ghost came to John's knee and set his head beneath his palm so that John's fingers buried in thick rough. Behind them, the bells were quiet. Before them, the road waited with its ordinary stones and its inconvenient puddles. What followed was not one scene, but many, and they were small. A letter with 7 seals cracked in a sept at White Harbor and read by a woman whose hands shook because she remembered her father killed upon a pier for the coins he would not give a soldier. She listened anyway, and afterward baked bread with oil scented like an herb the mother liked, and sent a loaf to the godswood with a note that said simply, "Yours as long as we are us." A lord in Barrowton who did not care for many things beyond the shape his hounds made upon his floor when they slept had a weirwood on his land that had been left to rot when the undulls came. His steward, after hearing the accord in the yard, went and cut ivy loose from its face so that a scarred mouth could see weather again. A boy crossing the neck with eels for market bound a shard of dragonglass to his wrist because the old frog-eaters had said so, and when men on the road sneered, he lifted his other hand and said he carried one for a friend as well, being careful to look like a fool, which is braver than looking like a saint. In the Riverlands, poor fellows brought a man wearing an iron star into a court where a Tully banner still hung on a wall from the days when banners gathered dust instead of blood. The court listened. The man spoke of devils living in trees. The court did not laugh. It put him to the question about who had put the blade in his hand, and he said at last what men always say. It was an idea, he said, stubborn as frost. The court did not put the idea on the block. It put the man there and took his hand, and then put him to labor naming trees that had stood since his great-grandfather's grandfather and perhaps never been named because they had never needed it. He grew broad. He grew quiet. He began to bring water without being told when he saw women kneading bread in a churchyard where before he would have kicked their pans and told them their God did not like to smell wheat with sugar. In King's Landing, a man in a heavy robe listened to Septon Reynard while the candle smoke drew crowns upon the air and then breathed them into nothing. He touched the marks on his wrist where once chains had chafed him and remembered something like hunger and something like love. It was hard to tell them apart sometimes. He signed a letter and sent it north. He tore another letter up, one that asked to send armed brothers into a village near the stony shore to break a festival involving antlered masks and singing. He ate soup that night, thin and unworthy, and told a girl kneeling to his right to eat hers too and not call hunger a prayer unless no bread remained in all the city. At Winterfell, the gods would stood. The red leaves listened to snow. They listened to whispers that did not stir the air. They listened to steps. A man who was both a Stark and not a Stark stood under them and put his hand upon the face carved when no one remembered who had cut. He thought of faces in other places and faces not carved at all. He thought of his father kneeling here and of a boy listening to ravens and wanting to be the sound they made. He thought of his sisters, one whose words had grown flint and flour both, one whose feet had learned the names of roads his mouth never would. He thought of those beyond the wall, and of those within the shores of the god's eye. He did not think of peace as a thing one could hold. He thought of it as the space between breaths in which men might put work. He thought of fire that did not crackle with screams and of cold that might be met with more than blankets. He thought of the world as having corners, and of a promise you touched when you turned one of them. Snow came and men rang bells. Somewhere, a man took a shard of obsidian from a box and, hands shaking, set it in an arrowhead and did not wonder whether the 7 or the faces would frown to find him fighting for life with stone. Somewhere else, a woman led a child into a sept and showed her the lights and told her the story of a day when men decided not to cut a tree. The child listened, and when she slept, her dreams had a leaf in them and a light. On the Isle of Faces, the Greenwood's daughter walked beneath leaves. The green men moved like old memory moves, quiet and complete. Things grew that had no name and did not require one. There was a spring that never failed. There were faces that never closed their eyes. They had seen conquerors and lovers and boys too brave and girls who would never be told they should not have been born. They saw what came next without asking to be praised for it. Jon Snow lay once more upon a hard bed that knew his shape. Ghost curled at his feet and twitched when he ran in dreams, which proved he was still capable of being a creature that did not require the world to justify itself. In the night, Jon woke and listened to the wind at the shutter. It hummed one of the old, nothing songs that winds know. He thought of a rib on a mat and the way a man's hand had tightened around it and recognized wrongness. He thought of the iron star in reeds and decided that if men must make stars, they should make them out of bread set upon tables. He was one man. He was two if he believed the woman in green. Either way, he had work in the morning. The night was patient. It would wait while he slept. It would wait while he rose. It would remember what was promised, because men were poor at remembering when frightened. And the night was nothing if not practice at what it was. The next days were a long thread through a fabric that had been woven before he was born. He walked it. He tied knots where fray showed. He cut threads where they tangled into strangling. He bribed with words and truth, with promises that tasted like things men had always wanted to say. He sent orders on thin, fast horses. He sent explanations on slower carts pulled by patient oxen. He sent jokes because Reed had been right. Men pass laws. Jokes pass from mouth to mouth and do more work than they should. On a wet morning at Moat Cailin, a small company of warriors' sons rode to the causeway and halted before the drawn stakes, and the men who watched them with an expression that did not care whether the stars sewed upon their surcoats had 8 points or 6. They saw only the armor and its weight. The foremost of the riders raised his visor. It was a soft-eyed man with a scar on his jaw that made his mouth look stronger than it was. He lifted a scroll. "By order of the High Septon," he read, "and with respect for the terms of the accord on the Isle of Faces, we ask safe conduct to White Harbor to collect alms for the orphanage of the mother there and return with the same, bearing no blade longer than a belt knife, and not preaching save in those houses whose doors open to us." The guard captain had a face like meat dried to keep through a winter. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Accord says we aren't to bar them if their papers are right, and if they wear tongues with a governor, and if they do not bring swords." "Aye," said the man beside him. "Accord says further that if they lie, we get to turn them around and kick them in the part that makes men be men, and call it holy." The warriors' sons took the causeway at a walk. One of the younger men turned his head to see the gods' wood beyond the abandoned stones. He allowed his eyes to rest there for as many heartbeats as counted for a man's breath between fear and relief. No one threw anything at him. No voice cried heretic. He let breath out as if he had dropped a sack. He thought of the accord then. He had not believed in it when they left King's Landing. He had left believing in nothing more than the clean sound of his own sword on its whetstone. He touched the leather-sheathed hilt of the knife he was permitted and found it did not comfort him. That, he decided, might be good. In a village outside Old Oak, a woman whose father had been of the Reach and had married a man from the north wrote a letter to no one and burned it upon her hearth. It was a silly letter. It said things like, "When I was a girl, my father took me to the sept and told me to look at the light for the maiden, and I thought it was for the crone because it made sense that the wisest should get the brightest light. But later I learned the old gods had no lights, and that made sense too because they did not need them." The ash that rose from the letter stuck to the kettle and made a shape that looked like a 7-pointed star with leaves laid over it. She laughed alone. She said, out loud, to air and to whoever listened in it, "We can hold 2 things in our hands." And it turned out her hands were big enough. Winter sharpened itself upon the stones of the world while these small moments happened. It did not mind them. If anything, it liked them. They made the cold's work cleaner in a way, because when men held to one another for reasons other than fear, they did not spend quite so much time stabbing one another in the belly while the snow did what snow does. The others did not stop coming because men stopped cutting each other. But less blood in the lanes meant more hands upon spears where it mattered. There were failures. There were flares of wild and righteous fury. A sept burned near the wolfswood because a lord's brother decided the accord had insulted his mother by telling her not to tell other people's mothers what to do. A weirwood in a back meadow near Fairmarket was cut by night by men who blamed it for a fever. The fever passed because fevers do. The stump all winter looked like a jaw, and the men walked by it without meeting its gaze the way men walk by the houseless. Jon kept a list in his head of things he would never be able to mend. He took it out at night and added to it, and then he put it away because to keep it out would make the day a cage for everything he might yet do. In the worst cold, at Eastwatch, men arrived at the gate who had once been boys Jon had sent out with ropes and knives to scout. They carried with them a story none of them could tell without dropping pieces because the pieces hurt fingers that touched them. There had been white shadows. There had been a swarm of lights like sparks turned to living things. There had been a man who had sung under his breath to keep his courage and had found that the song made the air not warmer but unwilling to take him. They had fought. Dragonglass and Steel Bitter as Old Sin had done their work. Most were not dead. Some were. Jon went to the top of the wall in the dark and looked north and saw a line like a thought. Nothing visible exactly, but the feeling a man has when he realizes a room has one more door than he had first seen. He put his hands on the ice and did not think of gods. He thought of Ed below, counting arrows, of Reynard south, wearing his voice thin on sermons that said nothing and meant everything, of Greenwood's daughter pouring water and letting 7 drops fall where men had gripped knives, of Ghost sleeping, trust curled like another animal inside his chest. He thought of the accord and did not make it larger or smaller than it was. He let it be what it had been. A set of words told under trees on a day when men might have cut one another and instead took each other's wrists and held on. When dawn came, it came quiet, as it often does after long nights that have tried to convince men they will never see it. He went below. He ate broth that tasted of the bones a cook had begged off a merchant and boiled twice. He told 3 jokes badly. He let Ed tell one better. He sent 2 men down the coast with a box of glass. He wrote a letter to White Harbor that said, in a hand that had gotten more angular with worry, "Keep the bells clean. Rust eats warnings first." He wrote another to Septon Reynard that said, "There was a man by the sept who used to strike his dog. He has stopped. I think he needed permission more than a god." He wrote a third to no one, and folded it and put it in the chest where the shard had lain, and did not know whether he would ever show it to anyone. It said simply, "We did not cut the tree." In spring, if one could rock one's head and call what came by that name. He returned once more to the Isle of Faces. He went alone save for Ghost. Reed was there before him, and the Greenwood's daughter, and a boy whose hair had the color of wet straw and whose eyes would be old too early because he had seen much that old eyes can sometimes be spared seeing. Septon Reynard did not come. He had died, his letter said, of a fever that took him too quickly to instruct his body how to leave. His last note to Jon had been half a page of apologies for all the words he had failed to say, followed by a single line that said, "The smallest of things in a hand that means it is a cathedral." Jon stood beneath faces that had watched so much and tried not to imagine them seeing him. "We will keep telling it," he said into Green that was listening without a trace of his voice in it when it returned. "Stories are like bridges," Greenwood's daughter said. "You must walk them even when you do not trust the men who laid the first planks." She set her fingers, briefly, against the bark, then turned her palm up, as if asking rain for alms. Came a soft patter. Jon tipped his face into it. Ghost shook himself and looked very offended. The boy with the wet straw hair laughed and then looked ashamed of the laugh as if he had taken something without paying. Reed clapped him on the back and told him this was weather, not a market. Jon remembered himself the first day he had come here. He was still that man. He was not him at all. He had made a thing with others that was not a law and not an oath but something that behaved in the world as if it were both. He had cut the day to make room for less cutting. He had told men to leave the trees and the stars alone and to love the living things between. He had made a story and watched as it walked without him sometimes and fell and was picked up by other hands and carried. Under the leaves, the light had the color of old copper. The lake's skin threw back 1,000 small suns. In the carved mouths, rain collected and ran. Could have been weeping. Could have been only rain. Jon decided it did not matter which. He lifted his face into it and let the drops find his mouth. He tasted water that had been pulled through soil that remembered everything. He did not pray. He did not need to. He spoke instead the words that had taken their own shape without asking the permission of God or man, and that were, perhaps, the only prayer needed. "We will not cut," he said softly. "We will not burn. We will ring bells and gather glass and leave our doors unbarred to those who come cold and needing. We will tell it again." He looked at Ghost. The dire wolf yawned, offended and loving and himself as anything in the world could be. Jon smiled back. The smile felt like a small, hard, honest coin. It felt like a thing a man could pay the world with and not be told his hand was counterfeit. Then he went back to the boat and to the work and to the long winter. And the accord, which was not a parchment and not a trumpet, did its quiet, stubborn work where men could not see it. In the spaces between old hates, in the angles where knives might have gone and did not, in the hands of those who took each other's wrists and held on in the cold, telling one another a story they had decided to make true.